what is feel anyways? It kind of seems like one of those intangibles that all the great drummers have, but that we don't have. But what's cool is that feel doesn't have to be a conceptual in the clouds discussion. This is something you can learn, and we can actually break this down into 2 steps that'll really help your playing feel way better. Also, we can learn how feel is ultimately more important than time. This is really interesting. Here we go. Hey, as we get rolling today, I want to give you a free gift. It's in the description below. It's called the Fast Fluid Hands Checklist. It's a free PDF e-guide that breaks down the basic core steps to achieving freedom with your hands. We want to have freedom with our hands so we can play as fast as we want to, as loud as we want to, and quietly and not feel clumsy also. This helps you play singles well, doubles well. So much of drumming stems from good hand technique. It's so crucial, so core. And so if you're struggling with anything resembling what I just mentioned, then it's very likely that hands are the culprit. Go check out that free guide. It's definitely going to help you out. All right, on with today's lesson. Your audience will perceive your sound and dynamics more than they will your time, which is interesting, but it's true. Unless you just have terrible time, if your time is pretty good, then the average audience member, especially non-musician, is not going to notice if your time is moving just slightly, but they will notice if something just sounds bad, or if you're not hitting things consistently, and so each backbeat doesn't feel steady. Those are the things that average people will perceive as bad time, even if the time is good. And so this is kind of what we're digging into today, the fact that as long as you've got good time, as long as your time is decent and pretty good, as long as you're playing tightly with your band members, really the sound of your drums and the dynamics, the volume at which you're playing, is ultimately more important than time. That's what we're digging into today. We're going to dissect this a little more. So if we want to try to define feel, we have to ask, well, which elements contribute to feel? So what elements do we need to have in order to have good feel? And so those 2 things are sound and dynamics. We need to have the appropriate sound, and we need to have accurate, proper dynamics. And so as far as sound goes, we're just talking about drum tuning and how we're hitting, making sure our drums are tuned the way that they need to be for whatever gig we're playing, whatever style of music we're playing, and even where we're hitting the drums. Like, are we playing rim shots on the snare? Are we hitting the center of the toms? How are we hitting our cymbals? And so those are all the things that affect our sound, and that's an important part of feel. And of course, dynamics, how loud you are, so just as simple as that, how loud you are, but also how the kit is mixed, because you could play a steady groove that has just all these mixed up dynamics where cymbals are too loud and drums aren't loud enough, and it's not going to feel right because it's not going to feel strong and punchy and solid. Solidness and groove a lot of time comes from strong drums, like drums that you can feel, feeling the kick, having a steady backbeat you can feel that isn't overcome or washed out by too much cymbal. And so the kit's got to be mixed well, and so that's the important part of dynamics. And so literally what we just talked about in the last couple of minutes here, this sums it all up. So the rest of the video, we're just going to break this down even more. I'm going to show you more examples of this, and we're going to wrap up with how to practice this, like how to actually practice playing with better feel. Now, also just to throw this in as a side note, a lot of times when you're listening to your favorite records and you think, wow, that drum sound is so cool, it feels so great, there are often a lot of things that are done in post-production where after the drums are recorded, there are things that are done in mixing to make the drum sound a certain way, and sometimes to make them sound better or to cover up for maybe a not perfect drummer who recorded. There's all sorts of things in editing and just post-production things that can happen when the track's getting mixed. And so those elements can definitely affect the overall feel of a drum track in the end. And maybe the feel is this weird, distorted, like crazy sounding drum sound that almost sounds electronic. Maybe that's the feel of the drums on a particular song you've listened to. That's not the way the drums sounded acoustically in the room, but that's the way they've been made to sound. And so sometimes that happens, and so that's kind of something to also consider here, that if you're striving for a certain feel that maybe you've heard on your favorite song, you might not be able to achieve that acoustically, but you could when you record. But needless to say, in today's lesson, we're focusing on what can we as drummers directly affect in real time as we're playing. So how can we develop great feel just organically in the room as we're playing? That's what we're focusing on. So hopefully just to demystify some of this, because I know feel has always been one of those just mystical things. I know for me, it was always kind of a constant journey, a quest, trying to figure out what is good feel, what is pocket. When people talk about this, what are they actually talking about? Because it's just one of those terms that's used so loosely that we don't actually think about what it means, and not many people are really able to define it. So I'm gonna give you my best definition here. What makes a drum track feel good? Here's what I think the answer is. Great feel happens at the intersection of steady time, appropriate sound, and good dynamics. So when you've got steady time, appropriate sound, and good dynamics, those three things all mixed together in the right amounts, everything is done correctly there and to the best of your ability so that it fits the song, fits the style, that's when great feel happens. And so that's gonna look different in every musical situation. It's gonna look different in different rooms that you might play in, different bands you're playing with, different styles, different songs. And so there's no one answer. So what we have to talk about are all these factors that go into affecting great feel so that we can learn how to consider all these things to make sure that our playing is feeling good, whether we're playing loudly, softly, rock, jazz, fusion, whatever. So steady time needs to be a given. We talked about that in a recent lesson a couple weeks back. I'll link it in the description. If you want to check out that lesson, please do if you feel like time is something you need to work on. But we're assuming that, okay, you've got some decent time going on. We're human. Our time cannot ever be perfect. Definitely not for me. Maybe there's some drummers out there who can get near perfect. I know I'm not. So we're striving for steady time, steady time. So what we're digging into today are the appropriate sound and good dynamics. And so that's what we want to talk a little more about, specifically dynamics and kit mixing. How do we need to mix our drums so that they sound the best they can sound? This is the difference between an amateur drum sound and a professional drum sound. When the drums aren't hit right, when they aren't mixed right volume-wise, it tends to sound just cheap, amateur. Even an expensive drum set won't sound great. But when you mix the kit right, and especially when you tune it as well as you can, and you mix it well, you hit things the dynamic they need to be hit, then you sound much more professional than that kit might sound otherwise. So just to show you some examples real quick, we want to make sure that the drums are heard over the cymbals. So if we're playing really lightly, this means we're just tapping the cymbals, but we're hitting the drum. So if I'm playing in a small room, my dynamic might be something like, where I'm definitely going pretty light on the cymbals, a little stronger on the drums, but all the levels are staying pretty chill. Now, if I'm playing in a bigger room and there's not really volume constraints and I can go louder, I'm gonna play rim shots on the snare, so the snare is really loud. I'm gonna play the kick loudly, that way I can go louder on the cymbals without the cymbals being overpowering. And so definitely really loud drums there. And cymbals, I'm not slamming cymbals. I never like slamming cymbals. You can go pretty loud on the cymbals if you're loud on the drums, but most of the time we're still thinking of in terms of like gently playing cymbals, hitting drums. So more of the stick energy needs to go into the drums, and that's what creates a really good drum sound. We want to have a nice sturdy foundation for our groove. So it's such a fundamental thing, but not very talked about and not very worked on, and it's something that's often not exposed in your playing unless you're recording. And you start to realize, oh, wait a second, I'm not sounding so good. And so recording is a great way to make sure you're getting better at this and working at this regularly. So we want to always have the kit mixed well. We want that to be a default. But we also want to choose our drum sound based on what we're playing. And so to give you some quick examples of that, that might mean, let's say we're playing something from the 70s, like a song I play a bunch with my band, Ophelia by The Band. If you've ever heard that song, you know that it's just a really typical, like, dead 70s drum sound. And so what I like to do whenever I'm going for that sound on a gig, the quickest way to get a dead 70s sound, I don't have time to muffle toms, I can't take off the front head of a kick. Unless I'm recording in the studio, I have the luxury of doing that. But on a gig, I'm just gonna throw this bandana over my snare, tighten up the snare wires. You can pretty much get in the ballpark there. And so if you wanna have a great feel for a song that needs that dead snare sound, you've gotta have the dead snare sound. Otherwise, if you're playing it with like a deep tuned snare that's real gushy, then it's not going to feel right. No matter how good your time is, no matter how well you play the parts and how steady your dynamics are. And so that's where sound is so important, especially on the snare. You've got to have at least in the ballpark of the sound that needs to be there on that song in order to have the right feel. Otherwise, the song isn't going to feel right. And so kind of on the flip side, if I were going to play Purple Rain by Prince, there are really a lot of Prince songs. Quick cheat would be to head cut out, just throw the head cut out on the drum head. loosen the snare. So now we've got the deep gushy sound just in a couple seconds, and so now we can play a slow ballad and it's actually gonna feel big and beefy, versus if I played the slow ballad with the bandana, wouldn't matter how well I play it, it wouldn't feel right. So now we can get the right feel. It's also safe to say the most perceived instrument on your drum set by your audience is going to be your snare. You're hitting it all the time, and if you're playing backbeats, if you're playing a lot of groove stuff, then your audience is going to be hearing that all the time. And so if your snare doesn't sound right, doesn't sound the way it needs to in that room with that band, with those songs, then nothing you play is really going to sound right. And so I'll be honest, a lot of times if my snare doesn't sound quite right, if it isn't feeling quite right, it'll bug me like crazy. And so I'll be at a rehearsal or at a gig, and I'll just be tweaking it and messing with it until I can get it to feel right. And then suddenly, once it's feeling right, it's like, you know what? Okay, this feels better. Suddenly, everything else I play feels better. And so that's one of those things I've learned to get really in tune with, sometimes to an OCD point where it's like, I feel like I can't play well until I get my snare sounding right. But it's good to be really aware of that, because you can get by with toms and kicks sounding the same through an entire gig of different styles of music. But if you can change your snare around a little bit, that'll help you achieve the right feel. So sound quality, type of sound, tuning, those things are so important when you're talking feel, maybe even more important than time. At least once you've got the steady time, these are the things that are actually more important to focus on if you want to feel great. So how can we practice all of these things? How can we incorporate all of this into a regular practice routine so that we can develop great feel without having to create timing perfection? Because we can work on our timing to an extent. We always want to be developing our timing, but we have to know that our time is never going to be perfect. But we can get our feel really good even with imperfect time. So how do we practice this stuff? Hopefully everything we've talked about up to this point has made sense. Hopefully this is making sense to you. If any of it doesn't, just go listen to music. Go listen to some of the best records out there by the best bands out there. Go listen to your favorite songs and listen to those drum parts and try to notice, why is it that they feel so good? Why is it that backbeat sounds good? Ask yourself, how is the snare tune? Is the drummer playing rim shots or playing dead center? Notice how you can hear and feel the kick. You can hear and feel the snare generally more than you can hear the cymbals. That's just the best way to mix drums. If there's too much cymbal, it sounds horrible. And so in a lot of these recordings, if the drummer was hitting cymbals too hard, then in mix down, they end up using the close mics a lot and turning the overheads down a little bit so there's not so much cymbal. You always have to have that solid foundation of kick drum, snare drum. Those have got to be feeling good and feeling steady. So let's dig into some more nitty-gritty specifics here, how we can practice this, how you can get better at doing these things so that you're playing with great feel, and maybe even improving your time while you're doing this. 3 action steps. Number 1, always be mindful of how your drums sound. Tune appropriately. So just always be aware of what they're sounding like. As you're playing, think to yourself, do my toms sound good? Do they sound dead? Do they sound more resonant, more ringy? Are these the sounds that I want? Do I like this sound? Is my snare ringy or is it dead? Or like, I have this here that I use for muffling. Is it sounding like that, which is fine, or this? Because a lot of that's personal preference, but pay attention to that. Notice how your drums are sounding. Is your kick more boomy the way this one is? Because I have a head out on the front side that doesn't have a hole in it, versus if I put my other head on there that has a hole in it, the kick gets a little deader and a little more focused. Which sound do you like more? Which makes more sense for what you're playing? Just pay attention to these things. Be aware of these things. Step number 2, know the style you're playing and play at the appropriate volume, mixing your kit well also. Now, I know that this can be some tricky territory. If you're playing with a cover band, I've played with a particular cover band for 8 years now. We've played so many different styles of music, but we've played in a lot of different room sizes. We've played outside on big stages. We've played inside on big stages, inside on tiny stages, outdoor in intimate spaces. And so you end up having to figure out, all right, ultimately the venue, the environment is going to trump the song. And so if you're playing a Zeppelin song, so Immigrant Song is my example. It's a song I've played with this band for a long time. You're playing Immigrant Song, but you're playing in a small room, or you're playing on like a patio at a little winery. You can't just go at it. You have to chill things down a little bit. And so a lot of times you do have to sacrifice the ideal feel for a song and completely change the feel. You're having to totally change the feel and say, you know what, I'm going to play this more chill, or maybe you're even having to play with brushes. I've played heavy rock songs by The Killers with brushes before on gigs, because this particular band I play with, we're very versatile and we'll change up our style and do things totally different depending on the venue, which I think every good cover band ought to be able to do. And so sometimes I'm having to sacrifice the feel of the record to create a new feel. And so what you have to think about is, all right, if I can't accomplish the feel I want to accomplish, then what is the next best feel? If I'm going to have to play much more quietly, what's the best feel for this? And no matter what, it means mixing the kit well. And so if you're having to play something like When You Were Young by the Killers, but play it quietly, that means being really quiet on the ride, because otherwise the ride can get super washy, and making sure the kick and the snare can still be heard. And by the way, most of the time, drums are not what people will perceive as, whoa, that's too loud. When an audience member is like, oh, that's too loud, band needs to turn down, generally the culprit, if it's the drummer's fault, the culprit is always the cymbals' fault. If you're hitting cymbals too hard and going at it on a ride cymbal or a crash, that's what people are going to perceive as too loud, because it's a constant onslaught of frequencies. But if you're going a little louder on the drums, and especially if you're going loud on the kick, nobody's going to go, oh, that kick drum is so loud, he's got to turn down the kick. Never gotten that ever before. And actually, sometimes what's more common is that it's actually the electric guitar amp that's too loud, or the vocals that are too loud. Sometimes if a vocal's turned up too loud and they hit a certain frequency, it just pierces people's ears. And so a lot of times the drums are not guilty of loud volume anyways. A lot of times it's other things. So that's something to be aware of and have conversations with your band about if you're ever encountering that situation. And so sometimes you don't have to sacrifice feel and volume as much as you might think, as long as there's still a little bit of space and you can still have a little bit of volume. But step number 3, this is the most important one that we hinted at a minute ago. Be consistent in your volumes. Because if you're playing, let's say you're playing a 4 on the floor, like dance groove, and let's say we're even playing in a small room and we're going lightly, if that kick drum isn't steady dynamically, then the whole groove just feels weird. I'm gonna try to play it unsteadily. The funny thing is, when I try to do that, everything else gets unsteady dynamically too. And if dynamics are unsteady, then a lot of times that leads to time being unsteady. But if you can keep your dynamics steady, hit the hi-hat at the same volume each time, hit the snare same volume each time, same with the kick, even if that's super quiet, it still feels fine because the kick is steady, the snare is steady, hi-hat is steady. When dynamics get inconsistent, then things start to feel flaky, and it's like, it feels like it's gonna fall apart, and sometimes that actually leads to bad time. But if the dynamics are steady, that'll help you stay more in time, and everything will feel good. That's so important. And so the nitty-gritty thing to practice there is just listening to your kick. Try to play it in time, have your metronome going too, but listen to it, make sure it's the same dynamic, practice doing that softly. Which is kind of hard. If you're trying to do this steadily, softly, it takes a lot of control with your foot. I'm bouncing the beater. I think it's easier to play softly when bouncing the beater. And then get a little louder. And so practice just repetitively hitting things and being intentional about your dynamics. Same with the backbeats. And if you're wanting to do rim shots, you're playing loudly, practice rim shots over and over again. Same with how you're keeping time over here on the ride. Be hitting it consistently and steadily so it doesn't feel sloppy, doesn't feel haphazard. Same with the hi-hat. Or maybe your degree of openness needs to be steady. You don't want it to suddenly be more open and suddenly more closed. I could play that perfectly in time, but it feels so sloppy because the sound is so inconsistent. And so you want to be steady. It's that steady repetition. That's what people dance to. That's what people just settle back into and they can relax to. So you always want to have that steadiness. That's so important, and that's the most specific core thing you can practice out of this lesson. And so our big takeaway today is dynamics are the most important element of feel. Sound of the drums come in a close second. Time is kind of the third, where as long as your time's good, dynamics and feel are most important. You can get away with time inconsistencies, but sound and dynamic inconsistencies are more noticeable to your audience. So strive to get those really steady. Know that you can't ever achieve perfect time because we're human, but you can get near perfect dynamic steadiness and sound quality. So that's what I want you to strive for. Now, all of this hinges upon a super core foundational skill that you've got to really have under your belt in order to pull this off. It's funny how if you master your hand technique, like if your grip is good, hands are loose, then a lot of these things actually solve themselves, where you can sit here and play steadily on the ride, steadily on the hi-hat, because the stick is governed by the laws of physics if you're loose. And so you don't have to think about staying steady and staying even. Same with the kick drum. If you're just gently bouncing the beater, letting it get into a motion, then you can relax into that and naturally things are more steady. And so maybe that's where your struggle is, where you might start to implement the things I've shared with you today, and you might start to realize, well, I can get things pretty even, but I'm having to think about it too much. I want to be able to relax and just play the songs and have fun. That may be because your hands are still a little too stiff and you need to loosen up your hands more so that the sticks are bouncing around the drums more. You've got some stick height, some motion, which is going to help with steadiness. Having good hand technique helps so much with time and helps with dynamic control and steadiness. Crucial. So if that's you, if that's a struggle that you've had, download the free guide I mentioned to you earlier, the Fast Fluid Hands Checklist. It just takes you through 4 steps to unlock your hands for maximum speed and control so that you're getting that looseness and volume, and still you're able to control the sticks, control exactly when they play, but everything gets more easy and just more effortless that way. So many times this is the key to success, and it's the one thing that's missing from your playing. And so definitely go download that guide. It's been helping out so many drummers. This method works so well. It's what I teach to my one-on-one coaching students. It's what I teach to all of my online students. And people get big time results from fixing their hands, where you can actually practice these things on a pad and then sit down at your kit and it automatically feels better. So Fast Fluid Hands Checklist, it's gonna help you out. Go download it. Hey, and as always, thanks so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. There's a bunch of other non-glamorous lessons that get into the nitty-gritty, core, fundamental things that are so important to us sounding good and being musical on the drums. I want you to be the drummer you're called to be, that you are made to be. And so let's work hard at it by learning the non-glamorous skills. Thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next video.